Did you get the memo? You're supposed to own nothing and be happy. You're supposed to eat the bugs, and if you're allowed to have a car, it is most definitely going to be electric. In fact, car manufacturers have been rushing to get onto the electric car gravy train and saying things like all cars sold after the year 2030 will be electric. That's what some brands have been claiming. But there is perhaps reason to doubt that, and maybe to think that it might not actually come true. Correspondent Joanne Nova has brought this to my attention. Joe, thank you so much once again for coming on the Aussie Wire.
It's always a pleasure, Topher. And the EV's car story is extraordinary. And of course, the 2030 deadline was originally pushed by the EU and the UK. And it's been unravelled slightly and delayed by 5 years by Rishi Sunak's recent U-turn on that, and also by Germany pushing, because they've realised that their own manufacturers of cars are going to lose out in a big way, and that people just can't afford these EVs. There's a move now in the UK saying, oops, we've noticed that people who are renters and poor, they don't have street access to charging their EVs. It isn't going to be cheap for them. They've got to pay a lot of money to go to charging stations to charge their EVs because they don't have a driveway. Again, we find, EVs fine for the rich.
That's right.
Not so good for the working class. But there's been a string of bad news stories about EVs lately, which really suggests that this train wreck that's going on with the push to convert everyone to EVs in order to change the weather is going to run into a pretty major speed hump. So, I draw your attention, for example, to the story of the EV battery factory in Kansas, which is Panasonic were delighted to announce a new big battery factory. This is part of the money paid for by the Inflation Reduction Act. They got some $6 billion or something unbelievable.
Like that. Now, can I just pause for a moment? Orwell would be absolutely proud. He of course invented the idea of newspeak and the idea of legislation or bureaucracies that had a name that sounded all very well and good and was often the opposite of what they actually did. Throwing billions of dollars into a technological dead end, which is what EVs are turning out to be, is not inflation reduction, no matter which way you slice it.
No. And indeed, this Inflation Reduction Act may increase emissions and increase inflation at the same time. So, it's kind of 6 ways from crazy. But here we've got Panasonic building a huge new Kansas battery factory. And in order to keep it running, it's going to need 250 megawatts of electricity. So the local area in Kansas said, well, we'll just keep the coal plant running that we were going to convert to gas, and we'll just keep it running because we need to get that energy from somewhere, don't we, to make these batteries, which says something. It says we can't make batteries from wind and solar power because you have to keep shutting the factory down in the middle.
Well, this of course, and this is something that you've covered in detail over a long period of time. This is in addition to all the mining and the minerals extraction that has to happen, all the processing that has to happen to even have the ingredients to put into the battery, and then on top they have to burn fossil fuels, it could theoretically be nuclear in a different part of the world, but at the very least they have to have base load energy in order to be able to then turn it into a battery.
It takes a lot of resources to make an EV. As Mark Mills captured, he said it takes 250 tons of material to make one EV battery. So, it's an extraordinary amount of ore and earth they have to move in order to dig up the precious rare minerals that make the battery go. And it takes a lot of energy to do that. And of course, civilization's powered on wind and solar. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. There is no civilization powered with wind and solar. What a joke. The countries that have a higher ratio of wind and solar are struggling to be able to build EVs. Look at Germany, and they've still got a lot of power from reliable sources and interconnectors to the French nuclear and whatnot, and even they cannot afford to compete with China. And what's China powered by? Of course, it's powered by coal in order to keep those factories running to produce all the sacred EV batteries.
Now, this came unexpected for me. Volkswagen, in my opinion, they're a good car builder. I drive a Volkswagen, just a humble Volkswagen Passat, but I've been very happy with them as a car builder. I always thought that as they came online as a electric car manufacturer, I always thought they would bring the fight to Tesla, that they would be likely to displace a lot of other car manufacturers who were trying to enter that market as well. But it seems as though they've been completely cut off at the knees by the Chinese, or is there actually just an outright drop in demand? What is the story here?
I think bad news stories about EVs are spreading, and the secondhand price seems to be falling as well, which suggests that people have kind of realized the early uptake, the people who really want to try something new, and there's a lot going for EVs, those people have already bought one.
Yeah.
So without big government subsidies, the other part of the population, which is most of it, are saying, well, it doesn't really work for me and it isn't worth the money, and they can't get a cheap secondhand one. Well, maybe you can, but people obviously don't want to pay very much for those either. So it really does seem like a bit like the wind in the last few months. People have realized with the Siemens huge loss in their stocks there and their announcement that wind is going to cost a lot more to maintain. That news is spreading fast, that EVs cost a lot more than people thought. And, you know, we see that also in the insurance cost of EVs suddenly rising dramatically.
Well, this has actually led to some underwriters, some insurance companies actually pausing cover on electric vehicles. This strikes me as potentially devastating for electric vehicle sales. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is, we don't finance vehicles, but my understanding is if you want to get finance on a vehicle, you have to have comprehensive insurance. So if an insurance company is saying we won't insure, then what they're actually simultaneously doing is saying you can't buy it, because not only can you not get the insurance, but you can't even get the finance.
And this is extraordinary, but we have, and this is not all insurers, but it seems that those who are still left insuring EVs have put their prices up by a lot. I mean, they're talking about £5,000 for a year's insurance. I think that's an extraordinary cost to have to find to cover the cost of running your EV. And so one gentleman was shocked when he bought a EV a year ago, and his current insurer just sent him a note saying, sorry, we won't be renewing your insurance. You'll have to go and find someone somewhere else, because they just abandoned him as a customer and said, we're not going to insure you at all. So something has got through in the last year. We saw a few months ago, a big report came out talking about how EVs really need to be social distanced. So they don't, if a battery goes up, it doesn't set the rest of them on fire, as we saw at Sydney Airport, where, you know, one battery took out 5 cars. So the whole idea of distancing these cars, yes, you found the right picture. It makes it so much more expensive to store them. It also, it's hard to find people who can repair them. The parts cost more for an EV to repair, and they have to write off brand new EVs sometimes completely, because they don't know how to test them to be sure that the battery isn't going to spontaneously burst into flames after a scratch in 3 weeks' time. And so we will solve some of those problems, but we won't solve all of them. So there's something really inherently not good about the way EV cars are working at the moment, especially when insurance is being abandoned. And costs are rising in it. You can see there'll be a lot of people who were thinking of buying an EV who'll be going, surely, maybe not.
Well, look, I'm one of those people. I'm a bit of a sucker for the way that EVs drive. I love the instantaneous throttle response. I've driven a few of them. I love the low center of gravity. I love the way they drive. I love how quiet they are. And rewind 3 or 4 years, I would have happily had an EV as a second car. But with what I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, I'm now a hard no. We're not going electric in my family. I think it's environmental vandalism. I think it's financially irresponsible, and I just don't think it's. I want to have that ticking time bomb sitting in my garage underneath my house. I think there's a lot of people. You're quite right.
And think about an apartment building. Who wants to have an EV charging in the basement?
Yeah, no, that's a potential disaster absolutely waiting to happen. But it then begs the question, because so much has been thrown at this, and we now have so many of them driving around, all the Chinese ones, but also a lot of Teslas have been sold into Australia. We've now got these big batteries being built out there, a sort of grid scale, hardening of the grid and this sort of thing. If this proves to be a dead end, and let's not forget, early electric cars were first invented over 100 years ago. There's a reason why they ended and the internal combustion engine took over for 100 years and has now enjoyed 100 years of development since then. Yes, batteries have gotten better, electric cars have gotten a lot better, but clearly there are issues that we haven't resolved. If we get to the point where we're sitting there going, actually, this was a mistake, undoing this mistake is going to be prohibitively expensive.
Indeed, very much so. And I don't know if you heard the story recently of the poor MG owner who ended up being kidnapped by his own car. And in a sense, this is this is more about the software rather than the
Sure.
fact that it was an EV. But still, going electric for a motor vehicle, this is about freedom. It's about the ability to control your own car, and he couldn't. And this poor man Brian Morrison ended up in a car which was pretty new, being driven at 30 miles an hour in England, luckily at 10:30 at night. But he couldn't brake. He was left with steering. So this was not an auto drive car going out of control. This was an EV that simply had a software flaw of some sort that meant he couldn't switch it off, couldn't turn it off, couldn't brake. And so he ended up calling police, getting surrounded by 3 cars, and they managed to break it and stop it. But my question is, how would we know if he had been driving in peak hour traffic and gone through a red light and been killed before he had time to phone anyone? How would we know that a software glitch killed him? How many EV accidents have already possibly happened? And the accident investigation squad said, well, they drove through a red light, or they drove off a bridge, or they drove into a tree. And we won't know that it was a software thing unless somebody was looking.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne Nova, for that absolute nightmare material.
Because cheerful, isn't it? But let me tell you, those insurance companies will be asking, I presume insurance companies who are liable for those cars that hit trees and drove off bridges, they will now start asking accident squads, look, can you check the software on that car, look at the black box and find out whether the car misbehaved? Because presumably they won't be liable. The car manufacturer will be liable in that case. So that's only going to push insurance costs up, but it may uncover other accidents which we didn't know about were due to software glitches.
Well, I'm finding insurance is becoming a theme in my conversations with you. We've talked about insurance and the impact that it's having on ESG scores and sort of on that global scale of the heavy hitter investment firms and the way that they're trying to control things. And then insurance actually being potentially the Achilles heel in their plans that might hold them back a little bit. Insurance potentially being very, very relevant here in this EV story. I do find myself wondering whether insurance and the money risks, as you point out, follow the money, might be the thing that brings some sanity into all of this in the end.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because insurance in climate change just loves the crisis because, of course, they can charge more for events that are always going to happen anyway, that it makes no difference for. But if you scare the crowd, you can scare them out of bigger premiums, can't you? So the climate change scare, certainly insurance hasn't slowed that down. They've pushed it because it suits them. But yes, we see with EVs that the pressure is in a different direction.
Interesting. Joanne Nova, always fascinating to chat with you. Thank you so much once again for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Sophie.